dell'archivio della Pontificia Gregoriana, l'Università Gregoriana. Oggi abbiamo la presentazione del lavoro di Karie Schultz, che ha lavorato un lungo tempo con noi, e abbiamo il piacere di ascoltarla e di vedere quali sono stati i progressi del suo lavoro di ricerca. E ci accompagna anche la dottoressa E ci accompagna anche la dottoressa Ginevra Crosignani, che presenterà a Karie Schultz e poi ci aiuterà con alcune riflessioni sul lavoro di Karie. Allora, io do la parola a Ginevra Crosignani, che collabora con noi in diversi progetti dell'archivio e che ha accettato di farsi carico anche lei di questo seminario, alla quale ringraziamo veramente di cuore. Ginevra.
So thank you, Dr. Schultz. So Dr. Karie Schultz is currently a Rome Fellow at the British School at Rome, where she's pursuing research projects entitled British and Italian Intellectual Networks, the English and Scots Colleges in Rome, 1745. And she got her PhD at Queen's University of Belfast in 2020. With a dissertation entitled Political Thought and Protestant Intellectual Culture in the Scottish Revolution, 1638-1651. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So first and foremost, thank you to everybody at the Gregorian Archives. It's been amazing to be able to actually get into archives during COVID. We all know that's a bit of a challenge. So I've been very grateful for the invitation to speak here, as well as just all of the support that I've had doing my research over the past few months. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation with you today. So I'm excited to speak to you about education and confessional identity, looking specifically at the Collegio Romano in the 17th century. So 17th century people were no strangers to violent conflicts, ones which frequently forced them to leave their homes, move countries, and establish new communities abroad. They experienced prolonged warfare, political persecution, and religious oppression, often all at the same time. To escape these conflicts, people frequently uprooted their lives, moved abroad, and established new communities. Historians have been long fascinated by the experiences of these early modern exiles, including how they assimilated into their new communities despite challenging language and culture barriers. But students have not traditionally been considered as part of this story, primarily because many chose to voluntarily leave their homes to seek an education overseas. They did not flee persecution under the same duress as many of their contemporaries. However, Protestant and Catholic students frequently moved across Europe, and they were a substantially high number of early modern migrants. Additionally, they were an important group of individuals who moved between, rather than conform to, the traditional confessional and national boundaries, which have long defined our understanding of the exile experience. When students moved abroad, they formed intellectual networks with people from other countries, and they were taught according to a confessionalized curriculum, all of which challenged or reaffirmed their faith. The studies and my experiences of migration therefore allowed them to form confessional communities which transcended national and geographic borders. Much has been written about the movement of early modern individuals, especially about the new political and religious communities that they established. But in my work, I've attempted to investigate migration and identity formation instead by looking at the unique role of education and universities. More specifically, during my ongoing 9-month fellowship at the British School at Rome, I have researched the studies and experiences of Catholic students who left England and Scotland to attend their national colleges between 1603 and 1707. English and Scottish Catholics had to come to Rome or go elsewhere in Europe to study because they faced severe persecution and were barred from attending universities as a result of their faith back home. Following the Protestant Reformations in England and Scotland during the 16th century, living as a Catholic became increasingly difficult and dangerous in both kingdoms. Catholic Mass was made illegal, and penal laws punished those who openly practiced and demonstrated their faith. Catholics were also excluded from holding public office and from voting. The university served as another tool for restricting the spread and practice of Catholicism in Britain. The 5 universities in Scotland, which existed at the time, Edinburgh, Glasgow, St. Andrews, Marischal College Aberdeen, and King's College Aberdeen, as well as the 2 universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, were all confessionalized. This meant that only Reformed Protestant theology was taught, and students were required to subscribe a Protestant confession of faith to attend. University education was essential for the maintenance of Protestant religious conformity in Britain, an intellectual program from which Catholics were notably and intentionally excluded. Any subjects who desired a Catholic education, or indeed a university education at all, therefore had no alternative but to travel to a Catholic institution overseas. So my primary interest has been in those Catholic students from England and Scotland who came to study in Rome. Using the Scots and English colleges as case studies, I've been exploring how their studies and experiences contributed to their confessional and national identity formation. I've used archival material in the Scots and English colleges, the Gregorian University, and the Propaganda Fide to analyze the theological, philosophical, and political doctrines that students were taught during their time in Rome and how they put these ideas into practice. I'm especially interested in how their education offered them new ways of thinking about their national and confessional allegiances in response to moments of significant political and religious change in the 17th century. In today's seminar, I want to focus more narrowly on the research that I've conducted at the Gregorian archives over the past few months, research which pertains to the Collegio Romano, or the precursor to the modern Gregorian University. Students who came to their national colleges in Rome lived at their institutions, but they took their courses centrally at the Collegio Romano. As a result, the Gregorian archives today contain a wealth of material related to the curriculum and teaching at the Collegio Romano, such as lecture notes and philosophical theses. The archive also holds many manuscript volumes on philosophy and theology that were authored by professors who taught at the institution. Drawing upon this material, I want to show in today's paper how the education that students received at the Collegio Romano created an important confessional identity, which transcended national borders. The education of students reaffirmed the confessional identity amongst a diverse group of students who had all experienced significant displacement from their home countries, often for reasons of religious persecution. By attending an international and highly diverse institution, such as the Collegio Romano, English and Scottish students in Rome were able to prepare to return to their home countries and seek the conversion of England and Scotland back to Catholicism. So to show the important role that education played in creating and negotiating a confessional identity for 17th century Catholic students in Rome, I will first provide some background context about the Collegio Romano and its relationship to Catholic national colleges during this time period. I will then analyze the evidence of teaching and curriculum at the Collegio Romano that I've consulted during my time in the Gregorian archives. I will explain the content of just some of these sources and demonstrate how they created a confessional identity for such a diverse group of students in Rome. I will lastly offer some broader conclusions about the significance of this type of source material that's currently in the archive here, and the new directions in which it might take the historiographical fields. Before I discuss the curriculum and teaching at the Collegio Romano, I first want to offer some background context about the college's formation and its role in Rome during the 17th century. The Collegio Romano was established by St. Ignatius of Loyola in 1551, after he founded the Society of Jesus. In January 1556, Pope Paul IV gave the Collegio Romano the privilege of conferring philosophy and theology degrees. The institution was run by the Jesuits, included courses from elementary to university level, and trained students in philosophy and theology. The Collegio Romano also played an important role in educating students of multiple nationalities as part of the emergence of national Catholic colleges across Europe. During the 16th and 17th centuries, and especially after the Council of Trent's decrees about improving the standards of clergy education, Catholic colleges developed across Europe. These institutions were fairly small, were connected to a specific country, and provided students from that nation with a place to live and study while overseas. For example, as a result of the severe persecution of Catholics and their exclusion from the universities in Britain, English and Scots colleges were established and as an alternative for students who could not attend the universities back home. English and Scots colleges appeared in France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, providing Catholic students from the British Isles with an opportunity to train in their faith and seek the conversion of Britain from a safer location in a confessionally Catholic nation. Catholic colleges also existed for students of other nationalities, and these institutions were not unique to England and Scotland. For example, Irish and German colleges also existed throughout Europe as well as in Rome during the same time period. Although national colleges were created for students of many nationalities, my work has focused specifically on the English and Scots here in Rome. Both institutions were established in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The official papal bull of foundation for the English College in Rome dates from May 1st, 1579, although we know that the first students began arriving 2 years earlier in 1577. The Scots College in Rome was established a bit later after many years of negotiation with a bull of foundation on December 5th, 1600. The first students arrived at the Scots College in 1602. Now, before I discuss the Collegio Romano, I first want to explain some characteristics of Catholic national colleges and how they were distinct from early modern universities. First, they had far fewer students than universities, and they were created primarily to train priests and missionaries. Tom McKinley noted that 11 students attended the Scots College in Rome upon its foundation, and that there were likely never more than 20 students in residence at any given time. The English College had more students, beginning with 6 in 1577 and increasing to roughly 40 by 1579. However, it's unlikely that the number of students or residents at the English College in Rome ever rose much higher than this throughout the 17th century, given the limitations on space and finances at the institution. Furthermore, student numbers fluctuated in response to times of upheaval, which affected migration patterns across Europe, such as the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. Given their location in such a diverse and dynamic city as Rome, the colleges also offered students essential opportunities for building confessional communities which transcended national boundaries. So even though these were national colleges, English and Scottish students frequently interacted with Swedish, Danish, Dutch, German, Polish, Hungarian, Swiss, and Czech students, amongst others, all of whom had come to study in Rome. We also know that both the English and Scots colleges admitted students of other national backgrounds on occasion, and Catholic students throughout the city, regardless of their nationality, celebrated feasts and performed plays together. So despite these being national institutions, their very existence overseas provided students with transnational Catholic communities, which crossed geographic borders. Furthermore, these colleges had a distinct purpose in training students to serve the spread of Catholicism internationally. And the Collegio Romano would play an essential part in this aim. Following the Council of Trent's decrees that clergy education should be improved and that the priesthood should be made more accessible to people of fewer means, such as lower incomes, national colleges like the English and Scots College helped train students to become missionaries, secular priests, or enter religious orders. One problem that continually faced both the English and Scots colleges in Rome throughout the 17th century was getting students to actually undertake mission work rather than enter into a religious order or take up other careers. This was especially the case because the persecution of Catholics in the British Isles made missionary work highly dangerous and uncomfortable. There are a number of letters in the Propaganda Fide archives from the 17th century, written by English and Scottish missionaries, who recounted the troubling experiences they faced during their time in the mission fields. Such difficulties included violent persecution, having to sleep on floors without a steady supply of shelter, and not being able to minister to subjects in less accessible areas of the country, such as the Scottish Highlands. They consistently referred to the need for a greater number of priests and missionaries to help provide for pre-existing Catholic communities and for new converts. For this reason, missionary oaths were instituted at both colleges, which required students to serve the mission for a minimum of 3 years upon completing their studies. However, not all students went on to be missionaries or priests. Some were nobility and gentry who returned home to inherit their family estates or to work in positions of political prominence and diplomacy throughout Europe. Others organized support in the British Civil Wars of the 1640s or took up military careers during the 30 Years' War. So these colleges were not simply institutions which produced priests and missionaries, even though that was one of their distinct purposes. Rather, their students went on to take up positions of religious, political, and cultural importance on an international scale. So from the background of these institutions, I think it's clear that these national colleges served multiple purposes, both within and outside of Rome, and that they were important on both local and global levels. So having outlined the formation and purpose of the English and Scots colleges in Rome, I now want to explain their connection to the Collegio Romano, which will be the focus of the rest of my paper today. As I mentioned previously, the Collegio Romano was the central site in Rome where students from multiple countries came to take their classes in philosophy and theology. English and Scottish students attended the Collegio Romano alongside students from multiple other countries, including but not limited to Germany, Hungary, Sweden, and the Low Countries. Furthermore, professors at the Collegio Romano had diverse backgrounds and had frequently taught at multiple colleges throughout Europe before coming to Rome. Some stayed at the Collegio Romano for short periods of time, usually only a few years, while other professors taught there for much longer. The Collegio Romano was therefore characterized by frequent turnover and mobility in both staff and students. This made it an essential location for transnational knowledge exchange through the movement of people. It was ultimately a central site for Catholic students from across Europe to meet one another, and it served an important function by training students for the mission and to spread Catholicism internationally. So with this context in mind, I now want to analyze the teaching at the Collegio Romano with a specific focus on how this education created a confessional identity which transcended diverse national boundaries. During my past few months in the Gregorian archives, I've been reconstructing the intellectual environment within which English and Scottish students existed, using evidence of curriculum and teaching. I've been analyzing political, ethical, and theological doctrines that students were taught during their time at the Collegio Romano. These doctrines contributed to their confessional identity formation and provided them with a mechanism for understanding, communicating about, and contributing to developments back home. The Gregorian archives hold lecture notes and manuscript volumes written by professors at the college, in addition to printed philosophical theses. When used together, these materials shed significant light on the doctrines taught to students during their time in Rome and explain the intellectual culture within which they participated. I'm still in the process of working through the vast amount of material in the archives, so the conclusions that I present to you today are preliminary in nature. Most of the material is quite lengthy, it's often in difficult handwriting, and it's in Latin. So I have not yet completed all exhaustive or comprehensive research. But nevertheless, I'm excited to share with you just some of the material that I've discovered thus far. So I'll first explain the types of sources I've been using, how they functioned, and the conclusions that we can draw from them. And I think that will hopefully just give you a feel for the type of information that this material offers us. So the majority of archival material includes lecture notes and manuscript volumes written by professors in the 16th and 17th centuries. Lecture notes are highly useful for reconstructing the intellectual culture of an educational institution for multiple reasons. They demonstrate which ideas students and professors discussed while providing a written record of oral proceedings. From lecture notes, we're able to track the source material that professors read and used to develop their own ideas. Now, this is especially enlightening because intellectual historians like myself frequently focus on printed texts to explain the transmission of ideas. But from lecture notes, we can determine the doctrines that were taught to students and demonstrate knowledge exchange on a much broader social basis. This then informs us about how political and religious orthodoxies were created and constructed apart from the printed text in the early modern period. And this is something that I'll return to at the end of today's paper. But lecture notes frequently follow the order of standard Aristotelian texts, such as the Nicomachean Ethics, Metaphysics, Politics, or De Anima on the Soul. So they're very easy to follow, and different interpretations between different professors can usually be easily spotted. Furthermore, when discussing specific parts of Aristotelian texts, professors often included references to ancient, medieval, and contemporary authors with whom they agreed or disagreed, followed by paragraphs of lengthy engagement between the two. Lecture notes therefore provide a comprehensive overview of what professors at the Collegio Romano were reading, how they interpreted the ideas they encountered, and how they then explained these to their students. Apart from lecture notes, evidence of curriculum also exists in the form of manuscripts on theology and philosophy that were written by professors in the institution. These manuscripts comprehensively outlined the positions of various professors and demonstrated their intellectual engagement with core ideas of the day. Many of these treatises were never printed, but they show the engagement with the same legal, political, theological, and philosophical questions that were preoccupying many Catholic scholastic authors in the period who did write printed texts. Furthermore, many of these works include interesting underlining or marginal annotations in a different hand, offering us a better picture of how readers were interacting with these manuscripts and the ideas contained therein. A less common source, but one which is also useful, is philosophical theses. So these were essentially a set of propositions drawn from different parts of Aristotelian philosophy or metaphysics that students defended orally as part of a formal rhetorical exercise. Students would be given a series of summative conclusions drawn from Aristotle, which they would then elaborate upon and defend publicly. Professors at the Collegio Romano would preside over these defenses, and then the propositions would be printed at a later date. So philosophical theses are useful because they reveal the ideas that students were examined in. But I want to note that it's more difficult to gain a comprehensive understanding of university teaching from these philosophical theses alone, primarily because they were organized to show points of oral debate, so they're not entirely comprehensive written debates. So I have found a couple printed theses contained inside volumes of lecture notes from professors at the Collegio Romano, and those were usually theses over which the professors themselves presided. So using a combination of these lecture notes, manuscript treatises, and philosophical theses held in the Gregorian archives, it's possible to reconstruct the intellectual culture in which English and Scottish students, amongst others from Europe, were educated during their time in Rome. So with this background in mind, I now want to move on to the content of some of these sources and explain how the ideas taught to students contributed to their confessional identity formation. To do so, I'll present findings from just a few of the sources I have consulted, which deal with theological, philosophical, and political doctrines in turn. And this will demonstrate that confessional identity was not created simply from Catholic theology, as we might initially think, but rather from the teaching of multiple disciplines, including law, ethics, politics, and philosophy. So first, there are multiple commentaries and notes by professors at the Collegio Romano, which pertain specifically to the teaching of Catholic theology. As might be expected, these deal with key points of contention between Catholics and Protestants, such as predestination, freedom of the will, or the existence of purgatory. They also include lengthy discussions of election, human nature, and original sin. So a fairly standard approach to theological teaching can be found in a manuscript volume written by Nicholas Martinez while he was the professor of scholastic theology at the Collegio Romano between 1659 and 1675. This particular volume dates from 1671 to 72, and it contains 4 disputations related to the knowledge of God, the divine will and liberty, whether God predestines human beings to eternal salvation, and the unity of the Trinity. So I've listed the titles of the disputations on the screen here, but not all of the subheadings because there's quite a few of them. But I think this provides just an overview of the kind of questions that Martinez is interested in. In many ways, this is exactly what we might expect to discover from a professor of Catholic scholastic theology. And none of the topics discussed in the work are particularly innovative. But it's important to remember that Martinez did not write this simply to expound upon and teach his students the basic elements of Catholic theology. Instead, he focused on constructing the legitimacy of Catholicism in contrast to Protestant heresy. By expounding upon the most controversial doctrines between the two confessions, such as predestination or freedom of the will, Martinez was able to reiterate an Orthodox Catholic position which juxtaposed that of a heretical other. The study of theology at the Collegio Romano, as evidenced through Martinez's work, provided students with a theological framework advanced by othering opposing Christian confessions after the Reformation. Now, the defense of Catholicism against a heretical other was not just the remit of theology. The same perspective also appeared in philosophical works, and the teaching of philosophy was deeply connected to religious orthodoxy at the Collegio Romano. For example, the Gregorian archives hold a 1,500-page Latin manuscript written by Stefano Tucci, professor of scholastic theology, and I put just part of that up on the screen here. So in this manuscript, he discusses the juxtaposition of Catholic truth against Protestant heresy, but he does so in terms of Aristotelian philosophy, which I think is rather unique. So in this manuscript, which dates from January 1597, Tucci argued that atheism is the greatest calamity of our time, and that proper philosophy needed to be reclaimed from heretics. He argued that those who produced legitimate commentaries on Aristotle, such as Thomas Aquinas, were theologians first and foremost. Philosophy therefore had to be viewed through the lens of Orthodox theology, an aim he then attempted to achieve in the rest of his 1,500 pages. He reiterated Orthodox Catholic positions on core points of philosophy to challenge heresies advanced by people, Luther and John Calvin. And as you might be able to see on the slide here, he also calls out Zwingli, Calvin, Luther, and the Anabaptists as all contributing to this proliferation of heresy and atheism. But what's notable is that he connects their errors to flawed philosophy rather than theology. This source reveals that the heretical other, in this case, still Protestants and atheists, could be considered so not simply because of their corrupt worship practices or their misguided theology, but because of their fundamentally flawed philosophical doctrines. So although this was a written treatise by a professor about philosophy rather than lecture notes, it's still useful for understanding the intellectual formation of a professor of scholastic theology at the Collegio Romano. It tells us the type of questions that he was interested in and the ideas he may have relayed to his students when he did teach them. As these sources by Martinez and Tucci reveal so far, the teaching of theological as well as philosophical doctrines at the Collegio Romano educated students in Orthodox Catholicism and reaffirmed their confessional identity against the proliferation of Protestant heresy and atheism. Although students at the Collegio Romano were primarily taught theology and philosophy, political ideas were also subsumed into these disciplines. So I'm primarily a historian of political thought rather than a historian of theology or philosophy. And so for this reason, I'm always interested in the inclusion of doctrines in lecture notes or works by professors, which depicted a distinctly Catholic way of viewing participation in political life. So for example, one set of notes from 1599 pertains to metaphysics, but it also contains significant reflections on political ideas. So these notes are commentaries on Aristotle's De Anima and Metaphysica by Andreas Eudaimon Ioannis. He was born in Greece in 1566, and he entered the Society of Jesus in September 1583. He then taught logic and ethics at the Collegio Romano at the end of the 16th century. The Gregorian archives contain 12 volumes of material authored by or connected to him, but I'm particularly interested in his notes from 1599, which are up on the screen here. So I've shown the catalog entry for this volume because it demonstrates the type of questions he was interested in. So we can see all the different disputations that he's conducting and how he's interested in sort of the nature of metaphysics and things about human happiness and those sorts of themes. But I'm particularly interested today in the first disputation about moral philosophy. So in this section, he included a lengthy reflection on the civil state as one of 3 parts of moral philosophy. He also expounded upon human happiness, honor, virtue, and the highest good. So these are all Aristotelian concepts commonly treated as criterion for how human beings should live and participate in society. But one of the most interesting ideas that I found in his notes so far is a comparison he makes between the civil state and domestic society. This distinction was common in printed works, which traditionally define our understanding of Catholic scholastic political theory, such as those by Robert Bellarmine, Francisco Suarez, Luis de Molina, or Francisco de Vitoria. The comparison between civil and domestic societies directly connected to proper forms of government in both Protestant and Catholic thought. If domestic and political society were the same, then an absolute monarch was a proper ruler for the civil state because he ruled his kingdom like fathers ruled their households. God created the hierarchy of domestic society as a direct model for the political one. By contrast, if civil and domestic societies were different, then government did not necessarily need to be monarchical. So like most Jesuits, Eudaimon Ioannis here argued that civil society and domestic society were exactly the same in their structure. He suggested that the natural hierarchy of subjection in the family warranted only a monarchy in the civil state. So at first glance, this engagement with ideas about civil and domestic society seems fairly abstract and theoretical. But these ideas were incredibly important because the distinction was discussed at length in Reformed universities throughout Europe, and it was also used to justify greater parliamentary power during the British Civil Wars of the 1640s. Even though such political and ethical doctrines, like those I've just discussed, were not as overtly Catholic as theological and philosophical ones, Eudaimon Ioannis' lecture notes reveal a distinctly and uniquely Catholic perspective on core issues surrounding the formation and function of the civil state. This meant that he was educating his students to think about the political society in a way that resembled a traditional Jesuit body of political thought, one that also significantly affected approaches to civil authority on a practical level throughout the 17th century. So Eudaimon Ioannis also advanced political doctrines relevant to contemporary debates about the relationship between church and state. So in another volume he wrote on papal authority, he confronted the division of political and ecclesiastical power. His definition of political power was fairly standard, including the authority to make and enforce laws which bound everyone in the republic. He then combined his definition of political authority with a distinctly Catholic interpretation of ecclesiastical power. So I've tried to highlight in red here the sections I'm talking about, but I think it would be probably a little bit hard to see. But on the left here, he discussed how ecclesiastical authority included administering the sacraments, which political magistrates could not do. But he also clarified the relationship between the papacy and civil authority, debating whether the Pope had the power to interfere in the temporal kingdom by excommunicating a civil magistrate. And that's there on the right with the red line. So these questions were nothing innovative or new for Catholic intellectuals at the time. And such questions arose in famous printed works by Bellarmine, Suarez, and Molina. But I think this is useful for demonstrating how a professor at the Collegio Romano was thinking about and engaging with the same questions that were taking place in Catholic scholastic print culture. But he was teaching these ideas to his students, and he was keeping them well within the bounds of traditional Catholic political thought. So I'd like to move on to another volume authored by Vincenzo Cerruti in 1632, which demonstrates a similar engagement with traditional Catholic scholastic ideas about the civil state. So I've included only a few samples of the ideas he discussed here on the slide. This is a very lengthy volume, and he talks about quite a few Aristotelian ideas, but I picked just a few. So the first image on the left shows a lengthy discussion regarding the moral good and the proper end of the commonwealth, while the second image on the right includes a treatment of justice and law, a point of discussion that was undertaken in printed texts written by Catholic scholastics throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. These authors were highly interested in ideas about law and justice because they were needing to understand and explain how Catholic missionaries might engage with the individuals they encountered in the Americas as part of their missionary work. So from these works, I think we can see that those professors who taught at the Collegio Romano were engaging with traditional ideas advanced by Catholic scholastic authors in printed works on multiple levels. But this is important because it shows how they were then expanding these ideas to a broader social basis with their students. So the teaching at the Collegio Romano therefore provided students with a shared intellectual framework for thinking about and responding to the conflicts they faced, primarily the proliferation of Protestant heresy since the 16th century. Professors at the Collegio Romano reclaimed and reaffirmed a longstanding tradition of Orthodox Catholic theology, philosophy, and political thought by redirecting it against a heretical Protestant enemy. So this material from the Gregorian archives has demonstrated how confessional ideas were taught through theology, philosophy, law, ethics, and politics. The formation of confessional identity was not the remit of theology alone, as we might initially think, but it was deeply ingrained in multiple disciplines taught at the Collegio Romano. The teaching also became rather defensive and focused on controversies, which would enable students to argue against the proliferation of blasphemy and heresy. For this reason, students who took their courses at the Collegio Romano could gain a renewed sense of confessional identity by reaffirming their beliefs and allegiances in contrast to an enemy other. Theological, philosophical, and political ideas taught at the Roman College, although not particularly innovative in the sense of producing new and radical advancements or developments, can therefore still be regarded as an important contribution to building and affirming confessional identity in a religiously tumultuous period. So in this sense, I think the Collegio Romano serves as an important case study for the centrality of education to building confessional identity and contributing to the spread of international Catholicism in the post-Reformation period. Even though the education at the Collegio Romano did offer a confessional framework for students to interpret the world around them, contemporaries did not always see this education as highly or the most effective. As I mentioned previously, many students who studied at the Collegio Romano trained to become missionaries and priests. But there were some challenges posed to this curriculum when applied to the mission field. So in the Propaganda Fide archives, I've come across a few sources which reflect uncertainty regarding how effective this education really was in preparing students to undertake mission work. So I'm unable to photograph material in the Propaganda Fide archive, but I've provided some transcriptions and translations of the relevant material here. So for example, in a letter from 1668, Alexander Winster wrote to the congregation of the Propaganda Fide with a list of supplications that he believed would benefit the mission in Scotland. He spent the entire first half of the letter explaining all the difficulties that missionaries faced. He lamented that there were so few missionaries, arguing that this was the most significant hindrance to the success of the conversion of Scotland. But according to Winster, missionaries in Scotland were so few in number that they had difficulty reaching treacherous parts of the landscape to minister to pre-existing Catholic communities, such as those in the Highlands. He stated that the fourth impediment is the scarcity of missionaries, the number of who, although about to increase this year not moderately by the charity and benevolence of your eminences, is still so small that a much bigger number is needed for feeding sheep so spread out across so many provinces. Now, to solve this problem, Winster made some supplications to the Propaganda Fide about using the Scots and English colleges abroad to increase the supply of missionaries. He made a variety of proposals regarding the financing of the colleges, the increase in pensions for priests, and stricter requirements that students would serve the mission upon the completion of their studies. But what interests me most about Winster's letter is the comments he made about education. He told the Propaganda Fide that there were other exercises and practices which would be more beneficial for the mission than the current curriculum. As he stated, although there are other exercises beyond the studies of philosophy and speculative theology for carrying out mission work and the conversion of Scotland, which the colleges must consider no less necessary, there is nevertheless almost no curriculum in place for this in the colleges. He concluded by stating that he supplicated with the most earnest prayers that students might be instructed several times a week in private and domestic reflections, including listening to sermons. So Winster was not saying that the study of philosophy and speculative theology was a complete waste of time, but he was emphasizing the need for more building up in the faith and preparation for converting heretics through reasoning, reflection, and argumentation. From Winster's letter, it's evident that he believed education at institutions like the Collegio Romano needed to offer more practical training for Catholics and emphasize reflection and controversies. This would better prepare them for the mission field than the traditional emphasis on philosophy and speculative theology, which was provided by places like the Collegio Romano. Nevertheless, I think the education still provided an essential foundation for students to reaffirm their Catholic faith from the perspective of multiple disciplines, even if this training required more complexity for practical application in the mission field. So I lastly want to draw some conclusions about the importance of this type of archival material and the ways it might shape future research in the fields of intellectual history, political thought, and historical theology. First and foremost, this type of evidence is essential for scholars seeking to understand knowledge exchange on a broader social basis in the early modern period. So intellectual historians like to focus on printed texts as vehicles for transmitting ideas. But we also know that the early modern world was an oral culture, meaning that ideas were often transmitted through conversations rather than printed text. Religious orthodoxies were taught to a broader population, including those who were not university educated, through orally rehearsed catechisms and sermons, rather than through lengthy printed theological treatises. Despite this, there is little sustained analysis of how religious and political orthodoxies were taught to the significant numbers of students who took up careers in the church or in politics and transmitted these ideas to the wider population through the spoken word. University education nicely bridges this gap by demonstrating how early modern people were trained to think about, discuss, and respond to the contemporary religious and political problems they faced. To understand the intellectual culture of early modern Europe and the way that religious and political orthodoxies were created, we therefore might turn more toward university and college material like that included in the Gregorian archives. Admittedly, this material poses significant challenges since it's often in difficult hand in Latin and several vernaculars and sometimes even uncatalogued. But I think there's an abundance of similar material in other Catholic colleges and Protestant university archives across Europe. And I think a survey of how students were taught to think about contemporary religious and political problems through their education is challenging, albeit highly worthwhile. Secondly, universities are an essential location for studying religious and national communities, networks, and identity formation. Apart from curriculum and education, the universities had a key cultural role. Historians of the early modern universities have long acknowledged that these were wealthy and powerful institutions, which provided for the maintenance of intellectual culture across Europe. Many students who attended national colleges in Rome went on to become statesmen, entered religious orders, served as secular clergy, or took up positions in European diplomacy and politics. Their education therefore had significant cultural implications as they could transmit the ideas they learned during formal training back to a broader population. It's therefore essential to know how they were educated to understand how they then affected political and religious policy on an international scale. Given the ways in which this archival material might improve our understanding of the intellectual culture of early modern Europe, I'll be expanding this preliminary research here in Rome into a much larger project over the next 3 years. In September, I will be taking up a 3-year Leverhulme Trust Fellowship at the University of St. Andrews, where I'll be exploring 17th century student mobility and education from a cross-confessional perspective. Thus far, my research has focused on the studies and experiences of Catholic students from the British Isles who came to Rome. While at St. Andrews, I will expand this to include Scots, English, and Irish Catholic national colleges across Europe. I will also use a comparative approach by examining Reformed student mobility from Britain and Ireland to Protestant universities in Germany and the Netherlands. I'll explore similarities and differences in the studies and experiences of Reformed and Catholic student migrants to continental Europe in the 17th century. So I think this perspective will hopefully draw upon this type of material and shed light on how religious and national identities emerge through both migration and education in the Catholic and Protestant experience. So these are just some of the directions that I hope to take this research in the future, and I think there are many benefits to studying this type of material in greater detail. But I just now want to summarize the main points of my paper today. From the research that I've conducted in Rome while at the Gregorian Archives, it's evident that for Catholic students who traveled to Rome from the British Isles or even elsewhere in Europe during the 17th century, the education they received at the Collegio Romano was intended to strengthen their confessional identity. They were not simply taught Aristotelian philosophy and Catholic theology. They were instead taught how to counteract the proliferation of Protestantism through the studies of theology, philosophy, law, and political thought. Students from many countries formed confessional communities at the Collegio Romano, and they set aside cultural differences to share in the common aim of furthering the Catholic mission abroad. In this respect, the Collegio Romano was crucial for providing students with an overarching intellectual framework for thinking about, responding to, and communicating about the crisis of the Catholic Church on an international scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shall I close this? Hopefully that will work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ginny.
Perfect.
Go ahead. Ginny, if you want.
Should I start, or do you want to say something?
No.
Should I start? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so I just, first of all, I want to say that, that Father Thomas McCool, who is a confrere of Father Morales, has written a lot about the English and Scottish missions.
Yes.
Jesuit, of course, only.
Yes.
But he's been saying, even in the years 2000, at the beginning of the year 2000, how much there's a lacuna that has never been filled in Catholic studies, about the English, the Scottish, particularly Scottish missions. So not only Jesuit Scottish, but in general Catholic.
Right.
So thank you for investigating all this. Also, so you just to contextualize, your talk. So it's quite obvious that. So obviously you focus on the intellectual history. So, yes. But just to contextualize all this, just to say that once this, let's say, political religious settlement is established in England, of course, and it's inaugurated basically by Henry VIII and then carried out by his successors, with different levels of, legal enforcement, let's say. But obviously, in this situation where the king is also head of the church, it's not only head of the state, it's also head of the church. Right. Anyone denying the supremacy of the English monarch as head of the English church is equals to treason. Right. So anyone. So and then anyone who refuses to conform to the English church is considered that can be equal to high treason. So obviously, in this situation, we can say broadly that Protestantism can be sort of identified with national British identity. Mm-hmm. And then what is Catholicism? So you're talking about confessional identity, mm-hmm. You're talking about Catholics. So obviously, when this sort of post-Reformation revolution takes place, what happens to the Catholic community? I mean, in England, they were the majority of the population, and then they become a minority, but they survive, mm-hmm. Right? So they have their own confessional identity that is maintained. So how do you sort of contextualize this with, so you're saying these students come abroad and they have to learn all these things, rightly so, but then they go back to their country mostly. And so what is exactly their contribution then of these studies? You know, how much do you think they contribute? Because the formation of the Catholic identity is already there. I mean, in England. So when they come back here, what is exactly you think the role of you know, if I may say it clear,
yes,
do you think how much this is important? You know, how much the formation of a confessional identity?
Right. Yeah. So I think that's very interesting, and thank you very much. So on one hand, I think there is a cultural confessional identity, which is obviously something that's established in England or in Scotland simply by being the minority. So I think that's very much a huge role of this. But what I'm interested in is looking at, so these students who come over, well, they have to come over because they can't really be educated in England or Scotland. So they, of course, have to go overseas. And so they're training very practically to then go back and serve the mission, or to go back and try to reconvert England and Scotland back to Catholicism. So I think the studies are very important because it's providing them with intellectual tools or an intellectual framework where they can do that. So they already see themselves as culturally Catholic and as part of perhaps an English Catholic community or a Scottish Catholic community. But I think what the studies do is really give them this framework and this sort of agency to then go back and serve, whether that's back home as missionaries. So whether they're then able to, you know, minister the sacraments, try to convert people through their knowledge of controversies, and the knowledge that they have of how do you then sort of target Protestant heresy, how do you argue against that and reconvert people. But then a lot of these students do enter other areas of political diplomacy in Europe. They enter high positions of political prominence in the kind of international Catholic Church. So I think being abroad and then being trained in this sort of international Catholic environment allows them to think about reconverting England and Scotland from overseas using the sort of hierarchy of the Catholic Church, using the educational training they have in controversies. So I think it's a very interesting interplay. Obviously, that identity is very much there and present in the British Isles, but then how, you know, when they come overseas, how does that contribute to forming further identity? And I think it's really the output of their education here. So when they are able to go and enter positions of prominence and try to reconvert England and Scotland, that I see is quite important. And one of the other things, if I might just add on, that I didn't actually get to talk about today, but I'm particularly interested in the relationship between confessional and national identity. So these English and Scots that come over, they're all studying at the Collegio Romano, they're all learning the same things, they kind of have this commitment to international Catholicism, but at the same time, in many ways, they kind of hate each other because, you know, England and Scotland had been unified monarch, at least in 1603.
Precisely. So
yeah,
that's right. So,
exactly. There's that huge debate about, like, what does it mean to actually be British?
That's the question I really wanted to ask you. You know, so what does it mean at this stage of English history to be British, and what kind of, so there's a confessional identity, but there's national identity. So in general, what do you think? What do you? I know it's a big question, and probably Father Morales wanted to ask this, but it's a huge topic, and we don't pretend to answer everything right here, but
no, I'm very glad that you asked that, because that is what more broadly my work focuses on. So obviously, with the unification of the crowns in 1603, being British is really highly debated, and what that means. So the Scots are quite unhappy to then have an absentee monarch who no longer seems to really culturally care about them or acknowledge them. So there is very much this fissure between what it means to be English and Scottish, and then also British. And so my work actually on the English and Scots colleges in Rome is quite interesting, because they are taking their classes together. They're learning what it means to be Catholic. They're learning to sort of engage in mission work. But then they're also trying to preserve their national distinctiveness. So there were quite a few attempts to consolidate the English and Scots colleges into one and simply a British institution, which was often highly resisted by people at those colleges themselves. There were quite a few instances where we get sort of tensions between these national identities. So for example, there's a letter that I still need to consult in the Vatican archives. But it's basically about this English bishop who's saying that he doesn't actually want to consolidate with the Scots college, because he thinks that the Scots are basically unwashed, and parents won't send their students to their children to the Scots college if they're combined. So in that regard, I do think we see this tension between confessional and national identities. And it's very interesting seeing how that plays out. And especially when the Catholic Church looks at the English and Scots colleges and says, well, you're British, so we can approach mission work, we can approach education in the same way for England and Scotland, but the students and the staff at the university or that their colleges here are actually resisting that, and they're trying to say, well, we're distinctive, you know, we're distinctly Scot, we're distinctly English. So it is very interesting, yes. So I hope that kind of answers the question. There's a lot more to be done.
Yes, exactly. So, because then we're saying that they would become diplomats also sometimes.
Yes.
So, but to deal with, let's say, European Protestantism in general, let's say broadly, and to deal with English Protestantism, sorry, it's a whole different story.
Yes.
Precisely because of the role of the monarch.
Yes.
And again, this split that it's you know, it's typical of British, let's say, subjects. You know, they have to be split between allegiance to the Pope in a sense and allegiance to the monarch.
Exactly.
So then, how do they answer? You know, when they have to face these difficulties at home. And there is a question that if you would like to answer.
Sure.
So it's 2.
Okay.
So
I was like, oh, okay, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay,
thank you. Okay, so I'll just read it out for people who perhaps can't see it. Okay, so the first one is, do we have much evidence of students of different confessions engaging one another formally or informally? Or were the student social groups mostly homogeneous with avoidance of the other? That's a fascinating question. So I don't think there's much evidence at the moment that I've seen, at least, of students from different confessions engaging, often because the institutions that they went to were confessionalized. So you would get Catholic students who went to Catholic universities or Catholic colleges, and those were often in different places from Reformed universities. So Germany and like the Low Countries and the Netherlands were quite the location where a lot of students from at least the British Isles would go to study Protestant, theology, and they would get a Protestant confessional education. So I'm not actually sure how many Protestant students would have been in places like Rome at the time. So it's mostly, I think, confessionally homogenous. I think nationally it's quite interesting because that's where you get the mixing of students from all around Europe. But in terms of students mixing sort of from across confessions, I don't think that happens particularly in the university or the college environment. And that might happen more in social settings outside of the universities. So I hope that answers the question a bit. And I think there's also a second one. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. Perfect. Okay. I'd like to, thank you for sharing. I'd love to, okay, so basically the question is asking me to comment on whether any of my archival investigations surprised me. Yeah, so that's a really interesting question as well. I wish I could say yes. I think I found more what I expected. So my background is actually in Reformed universities. So I have a lot of experience working in Reformed curriculum. And it's the exact same kind of sources. So Reformed universities also have lecture notes, student notebooks, philosophical theses, all the same sorts of things. So I was expecting that when I came in, that this was what the material would look like and the sort of ideas it would contain. So I wasn't completely surprised by any of the curriculum or any of that. I do think I was a bit more surprised to find that there were so many volumes written by professors here. I think that was one of the things I didn't necessarily expect coming in. I assumed that I would mostly be working on just lecture notes and student notebooks and philosophical theses. So it's great to see that so many professors actually wrote. I mean, I don't know where they found the time to do this, but they wrote, 2,000-page volumes, and a lot of those still remain here. And I'm quite impressed because it's all handwritten. It was just taken ages. But that has been the most surprising. And I'm still sort of wading through that material. So there's a chance that I will find something very interesting. But if you can imagine, 2,000 pages of Latin per volume takes quite a bit of time to work through. So yeah, it takes much time, yes.
But there is also, if I may say, add something about how many actually, do you have a sort of statistics broad, let's say, of how many actually went back to the British Isles to become missionaries? Because the period you're dealing with is quite large. I mean, yes. And then I guess the golden era, let's say, of the Catholic mission would be the 80s. Well, 60s, late 60s for secular clergy. The Jesuit mission starts 1580. So let's say 90s. Then by King James' reign, I think there is a sort of decline. I mean, this is as far as what I have studied. I don't know, what are your statistics? How many of these, let's say maybe in the 1600s, would actually go back to the British Isles?
Right. So I'm actually indebted to Tom McKinley for this, at least in the Scots College, because he has a fascinating book, and it really is just like basically a statistical analysis of Scots students at the Scotch colleges across Europe. And so I think, I'm trying to recall now, I don't have the statistics memorized, but I think he says something like 40% return to their home countries to serve as either missionaries or secular clergy in some capacity. So about roughly half of them actually go back to their home countries, or about half of them stay and form some, or they become professors, they do something else in Europe. Okay. What's also quite interesting is then when they do go back to serve the mission, they also combine with people of other nationalities. So you'd often get, you know, English and Scottish missionaries who've been educated at the English and Scots colleges going to serve the mission in Ireland, vice versa.
I see.
Sort of working alongside each other. So just because they come from Scotland, go to Scots College, doesn't necessarily mean that they go straight back to Scotland. But often because of language differences, they will go back to somewhere at least in the British Isles and sort of work in teams of maybe people who cross those borders.
Oh, okay, because as you said, and it is as you read, as you pointed out, there is a consistent lack of missionaries, particularly to Scotland. So is there an improvement? I mean, over the 1600s, do you think there is an improvement of missionaries that actually go to Scotland just and stay in Scotland rather than going around, as you're saying?
Yeah,
I would roving, British Isles or Ireland.
Of course. I would say I don't think so. I mean, the letter that I picked up from the Propaganda Fide from Winster, that was in 1668, and he was still saying there's a lot of problems of the scarcity. I mean, I think that's something that they constantly struggled with. And I don't think, I mean, that's why they had mission notes that they were hoping would actually get students to keep on with the mission. But I think in the end, there was always a scarcity. And so I don't know when that ended. That's something I'd have to look into a bit more. I'm not sure if maybe once perhaps like laws against Catholics were relaxed a bit, maybe that made it easier. But I think especially in the 17th century when it was so strict and it was so dangerous to be a Catholic, that there was never much of an increase.
Exactly. But also I think the situation is kind of different because the Protestant background, let's say in Scotland, is different from the Anglican religious settlement, right? That is
right, very much so.
Very much Calvinist, and the other one much more of a concoction of something halfway through Calvinism, let's say Geneva and Wittenberg, let's say. Right? Yes. Right. So I think there's probably a bigger problem with how to deal with also religious conformity in Scotland. And so how do the missionaries deal with people who actually are forced to attend the rites of the Church of England, Scotland in this case?
Exactly. And especially, I mean, obviously, like the British Civil Wars of the 1640s are all about that. And it's very much about those tensions. And I think England always had a bit more religious pluralism than Scotland does. Scotland's very kind of homogenous, especially after the 1640s for a while, it becomes very strictly Calvinist. Spiritual discipline is at a height, So I think that is true. Like even your experience of being a Catholic missionary in Scotland is going to look very different from in England. So I'm not entirely sure exactly how the numbers might have varied between England and Scotland. If people, came here and then just chose to go back to England because maybe it was a bit easier. I don't know. I'll have to do more work into that, but that's very fascinating. So thank you so much.
No, please, thank you. And Padre, did you want to say something?
Dire grazie. Grazie a Karie, grazie Ginevra. E noi abbiamo visto lavorare Karie a lungo nell'archivio, molte ore, con i manoscritti, un lavoro veramente notevole. Grazie Karie. Grazie. Sì, io per chiudere, oltre al grazie, avremo forse modo di parlare con Karie. Credo che potrebbe essere un aiuto chiarire il concetto di identità, che è ovviamente il concetto chiave in questo lavoro. Identità, cosa è un'identità personale, cosa è una identità nazionale, cosa è un'identità religiosa. E questo mi sembra che forse potrebbe dare forse alla ricerca di Karie un punto in più, una forza in più, no? E riguardo a questo pensavo, non so se Karie conosce un lavoro di Franco Motta. Non Franco Motta. Franco Motta ha lavorato molto, la tesi di Franco Motta è sulla teologia di Roberto Bellarmino.
Oh, sì.
E Franco Motta ha un articolo che io dopo Karie darò sulle controversie del Bellarmino, che è una storia molto interessante, perché le controversie, come lei sa, appaiono la cattedra di controversie al Collegio Romano, all'inizio del Collegio Romano, 1500, credo. Sì. E poi Bellarmino prenderà la cattedra delle controversie, pubblica le controversie a stampa, i volumi delle controversie, dopodiché la cattedra va via, scompare e rimane solo per il collegio inglese e per il collegio germanico, ma scompare dallo studio generale del Collegio Romano, solo per gli inglesi, per Anglorum in genere, Scozia, e poi la cattedra appare un'altra volta nel XVII secolo, alla fine del XVII secolo. Scompare nuovamente e riappare nel XIX secolo, a metà dell'Ottocento. Riappare la cattedra. Quindi, non lo so se a Karie interessa, però questa strada delle cattedre, delle controversie è interessante per capire. Franco Motta fa un'ipotesi di questo e dice, però sarebbe interessante che Karie riprendesse l'ipotesi di Franco. Dice Franco Motta, forse, maybe, è perché per tutti gli studenti del Collegio Romano non ha senso aprire le controversie, perché aprire le controversie era aprire le ragioni del nemico, dell'eretico. E chi non ha bisogno di contraddire al nemico, forse è bene che non ascolti le ragioni del nemico, perché potrebbe tentarsi e perdere la propria identità e andare verso... Questa ipotesi sarebbe interessante nel contesto dell'identità, di come mantenere l'identità degli studenti italiani che stanno al collegio, e forse è bene che non ascoltino certi dispute teologici sull'Eucaristia o su altre cose, perché, non lo so, potrebbe essere un'ipotesi interessante questo articolo di Franco Motta. Io darò le indicazioni bibliografiche a Karie. Grazie mille.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Grazie Lorenzo.
Grazie.